The winter of 1878 came down on the Gray Valley like a hammer. It was not a gentle season of soft snows and cozy fires. It was a predator, a thing of teeth and claws that stalked the flimsy cabins of the settlers, seeking ways inside. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the chinking between the logs. It poured down the stone chimneys, and it crept up through the floorboards like a phantom tide. It was a physical presence, a weight on the shoulders and a thief in the lungs. In the Gray Valley, life was measured by the height of a woodpile in October and the agonizing speed of its decline by January. The central conflict, the war that every family fought from the first frost to the final thaw, was against the insatiable hunger of the stove. The cast-iron stove was the heart of every home, a demanding deity that consumed split logs without pause. To let it go out was to invite disaster. Frost would bloom on the inside of the walls. Water barrels would freeze solid, and the deep, bone-aching chill would settle in, bringing sickness with it. The men spent their days felling trees and their evenings splitting logs, their muscles screaming in protest. The women spent their hours feeding the stove, a constant repetitive motion of opening the iron door, adding another log, and watching the heat get sucked up the chimney into the unforgiving sky. This struggle was universal. In every cabin, from the prosperous holding of Brant, the master carpenter, to the smaller, lonelier homes on the valley's edge, the story was the same. Children huddled under quilts, their breath pluming in the air of their own bedrooms. Families ate their meals in a tight circle around the stove, the only sphere of true warmth in their world. They followed the wisdom passed down from their fathers, the same wisdom that had built every structure in the valley: logs felled from the surrounding forest, walls chinked with moss and mud, and a steep cedar-shake roof to shed the heavy snow. It was the only way they knew. It was the right way. And every winter, it was a way that barely worked, demanding a tribute of sweat, toil, and a mountain of firewood that seemed to vanish like smoke itself. On the western edge of the settlement, in a cabin smaller than most, lived Elara and her son, Lars. Her husband, a mason from the old country, had been taken by a logging accident 2 springs prior, leaving her with a set of well-used tools, a handful of books filled with strange diagrams, and a quiet resilience that the rest of the valley mistook for fragility. She was an outsider, not by birth, but by circumstance. The other women saw a widow to be pitied. The men saw a problem to be managed. They did not see the keen, observant mind behind her calm, gray eyes, a mind that had spent 2 winters watching, measuring, and understanding the nature of her enemy. She had watched the heat shimmer and rise from her own roof, a constant, invisible river flowing away from her and her shivering son. One evening in late summer, as the first cool whispers of autumn began to snake down from the peaks, Elara made a decision. She sat with her husband's books, the pages brittle and smelling of dust and time. They were not books of scripture or poetry, but of engineering and architecture from a land of stone and earth. They showed diagrams of Roman hypocausts, thick-walled European farmhouses, and sod-roofed structures from the windswept northern coasts. She traced a drawing of a low, sturdy building with a roof that was not made of wood, but of a deep, packed layer of earth. A principle was scrawled in the margin in her husband's hand: thermal mass. Heat, he had written, can be held, not just made. The idea that formed in her mind was radical, an affront to every piece of conventional wisdom in the Gray Valley. She would not re-shingle her roof with cedar. She would not pack the walls with more moss. She would build a new roof, a heavy roof, a roof of clay and earth and sod. It would be a massive, insulated cap on her small home, designed not to shed the cold, but to absorb and hold the warmth she so painstakingly created. It would be a battery for heat, storing the energy from her small stove and radiating it back down through the long, frozen nights. It was a desperate gamble, born of observation and a dead man's books. She took her plan to Brant, the valley's unofficial leader and its most respected builder. He was a large man, with hands like oak burls, a man who trusted the tangible evidence of his own eyes and the traditions of his craft. He listened patiently as she sketched her idea in the dirt with a stick, explaining the need for reinforced trusses, for a waterproof membrane, for the thick, layered application of the clay mixture. When she finished, he looked at the drawing, then at her, and he chuckled. It was not a cruel sound, but a deep, dismissive rumble of certainty. "Ilara," he said, his voice laced with the kind of pity reserved for a well-meaning child, "that is a fool's notion. Wood is light. Earth is heavy. A roof of mud will bring the whole structure down on your boy's head before the first snow. And what of the rain? It will turn to a river of mud and wash away. We build steep roofs to shed the weight, not flat ones to invite it." He kicked the drawing, erasing it. "Stick to what we know. I can have my sons help you with new shingles. It is the proper way." His dismissal was the spark that lit the fire of community skepticism. The story of the widow's mud hat spread through the valley like a weed. Men would stop by her property on their way to the forest, leaning on their axes and shaking their heads at the folly of it. Women would whisper at the communal well, speaking of her grief having unsettled her mind. The children, echoing their parents, took to calling her cabin the Mud Pie House. The mockery was not loud or aggressive. It was worse. It was a gentle, pervasive chorus of doubt, a constant reminder that she was alone, that she was defying the collective wisdom of her entire world, that she was, in their eyes, a fool. But their laughter did not change the memory of the frost on her son's blanket, nor did it change the logic she had found in her husband's books. The laughter was just noise. The cold was real. And so, as the valley's men began their annual pilgrimage to the high forests for the winter's wood, Ilara began her own work. She started not with the roof, but with the foundation of her idea, the walls. The existing log structure was sound, but it would never bear the weight she intended to place upon it. Using her husband's levers, block, and tackle, she began the back-breaking work of quarrying and moving large, flat stones from a nearby creek bed. She dug new footings around her cabin and, with a skill learned from watching her husband, began to build stone buttresses, reinforcing the corners of the log walls. It was slow, grueling labor. Her hands, accustomed to mending and cooking, were soon cracked and raw. Her back ached with a fire that did not warm. Lars, too young for heavy lifting, helped by bringing her water and clearing small stones, his small face a mask of worry and trust. While she toiled in silence, the valley buzzed with the familiar sounds of winter preparation. The sharp, rhythmic crack of axes splitting wood echoed from every homestead. On the other side of the valley, Brant and his two grown sons worked with practiced efficiency, reshingling the roof of a neighbor's cabin. Their movements were a blur of confident action. One son stripped the old shakes, another passed up bundles of new ones, and Brant, with a speed that was almost mesmerizing, nailed them into place, his hammer a constant, percussive beat. They finished the entire roof in 2 days, a testament to their skill and the proven methods of their trade. The community saw their work and nodded in approval. This was how things were done. This was progress. They looked over at Ilara's slow, strange project, a woman building stone supports for a roof that did not yet exist, and they shook their heads. She was wasting the last precious days of autumn on a dangerous fantasy. After the buttresses were complete, Elara turned her attention to the roof itself. She stripped off the old cedar shakes, exposing the thin planking beneath. The cabin felt naked, vulnerable. For a week, she and Lars lived under a temporary oilcloth shelter inside their own home. Then came the new frame. Her husband's books had shown her designs for king post trusses, triangles of immense strength. Using the largest, straightest logs she could manage with her block and tackle, she cut and notched the timbers, fitting them together with a carpenter's precision. She did not have Brandt's speed, but she had a mason's patience. Each joint was perfect, each angle exact. She hoisted the massive trusses into place one by one, a monumental effort that took her 4 days. The new roofline was lower, less steep, a squat and powerful shape that looked alien in a valley of sharp peaks. With the frame in place, she began to create the material that had earned her so much scorn. Down by the creek, she found a deep deposit of rich, gray clay. For days, she dug it out, hauling it back to her cabin in a wooden wheelbarrow, her arms burning with the strain. She mixed it in a shallow pit with water, handfuls of dried straw for tensile strength, and horse manure for its binding fibers. She worked the mixture with her bare feet, stomping and turning it for hours until it had the consistency of thick, smooth dough. It was messy, exhausting work. The smell of wet earth and manure clung to her clothes and hair. This was the heart of her innovation, a simple, ancient recipe for insulation and mass. She laid a tight layer of thick planks over her new trusses, and on top of that, a waterproof membrane made from painstakingly rendered pine pitch and overlapping sheets of birch bark, a technique she had learned from a visiting trapper years ago. Then she began applying the clay mixture. It was not a fast process. She hauled the heavy, wet material up a ladder in a leather bucket, spreading it carefully, packing it down firmly, ensuring a uniform thickness of nearly a foot. She worked in sections, allowing one part to partially dry before adding the next to avoid creating cracks. While the other women in the valley were canning the last of the harvest and mending winter clothes, Elara was on her roof, covered in mud, building her shield. Finally, over the thick, hardened layer of clay, she placed a final layer of sod, cut from the meadow behind her cabin. The roots would hold the soil together, and the grass, come spring, would drink the rain. Her roof was complete. It was not beautiful. It was a low, green and brown mound sitting atop her cabin, more a part of the hillside than a piece of architecture. It was, as the children called it, a mud hat. It looked heavy, primitive, and strange. Brandt came by one last time before the first snow. He looked at the massive stone buttresses, the thick, low roof. He said nothing, but his silence was a final judgment. He had offered to help her the right way, and she had refused. Whatever happened now was on her own head. The first snows came in early November, a light dusting that outlined the valley in white. The community watched Elara's cabin, a morbid curiosity hanging in the air. They expected to hear a crack, a groan, a sudden collapse. But the cabin stood. The low-pitched roof held the snow, a thick white blanket that, as Elara knew, was yet another layer of insulation. The initial test had been passed, but it was a minor one. The true trial, the one that would prove or break her theory, was yet to come. The old-timers felt it in their bones, a particular sharpness in the wind, a specific color in the sunset. It was going to be a hard winter. The great storm arrived in the second week of January. They called it the Ice Wolf. It came not as a blizzard, full of snow and fury, but as a silent, invisible wave of Arctic air that fell upon the gray valley like a shroud. The temperature plummeted to depths no one had ever recorded. The world became brittle. Trees cracked open with sounds like rifle shots. The river froze solid to its bed. The air itself felt sharp, a physical pain to breathe. The wind that came with it was not a howling gale, but a steady, relentless pressure, a knife that probed every crack and seam of every cabin, determined to find a way in. In the homes of the settlers, the war against the cold became a desperate, losing battle. The traditional cabins, with their thin walls and uninsulated cedar roofs, were no match for the ice wolf. Heat was stolen the moment it was created. Brant, in his own large, well-built home, found himself a prisoner. He fed his stove constantly, the fire roaring with a desperate intensity. Yet, 10 feet away from it, the air was glacial. A thick layer of frost, intricate as lace, grew on the interior walls. His wife and children were wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pale and drawn. The wind slid between the cedar shakes of his expertly crafted roof as if they weren't there, sucking the warmth out of the attic space and, with it, the entire house. He was burning through his woodpile at a terrifying rate, a cord of wood that should have lasted 2 weeks, vanishing in 3 days. He was a master builder, yet his craft was failing him. Throughout the valley, it was the same story of misery and fear. Families abandoned their bedrooms, huddling together in the single room with the stove. The sound of coughing echoed in the frozen air. The constant, exhausting labor of hauling and splitting wood in the face of the crippling cold was beginning to wear everyone down. The proud, self-reliant people of the Gray Valley were being broken. Their proven methods, their traditions, their entire way of life was being defeated by a force of nature that simply did not care about their rules. Their homes were little more than wooden tents in a hurricane of cold. But inside Ilara's cabin, something different was happening. When the ice wolf descended, the change was immediate and profound. Outside, the wind scoured the landscape, but inside there was a deep, pervasive quiet. The thick, heavy mass of her earthen roof absorbed the sound, reducing the storm's fury to a distant, muffled hum. The wind could not penetrate the solid, seamless layer of clay and sod. There were no shingles to rattle, no cracks for it to find. The house was sealed. The true miracle, however, was the heat. Ilara kept her stove fed, but not with the frantic urgency of her neighbors. She used smaller logs, maintaining a low, steady fire. The heat radiated from the stove, warming the air, the walls, and, most importantly, the massive ceiling. The clay roof, cold at first, began to slowly drink in the thermal energy. After a day, it was no longer a cold ceiling above them, but a warm one. It had become a thermal battery, just as the books had described. It soaked up the heat from the small fire, and then began to radiate it back down, creating a gentle, even warmth that filled the entire cabin. There were no cold spots, no drafts. Lars played on the floor, comfortable and warm in a single layer of wool. The frost did not dare paint its patterns on her walls. Her home was not fighting the cold, it was ignoring it. For 3 days, the ice wolf laid siege to the valley. On the morning of the 4th day, the temperature held at its record low, and Brant faced a crisis. The pile of split wood he kept by his door was gone. His main woodpile was 50 yards away, a journey that felt like a polar expedition in the brutal cold. As he bundled himself against the wind, his eyes fell on Ilara's small cabin across the meadow. He stopped, struck by a series of strange observations. There was no plume of desperate, roaring smoke coming from her chimney, only a thin, lazy wisp that spoke of a calm, efficient fire. And while every other roof in the valley was burdened with a thick, wind-swept crust of ice and snow, hers was almost bare. The gentle, steady warmth from within had melted the bottom layer of snow just enough for the wind to scrub it clean. He saw no sign of frantic activity, no desperate trips to a woodpile. It was quiet. Too quiet. A seed of doubt planted months ago by her stubborn resolve, began to sprout in his mind. What if her foolishness was not foolishness at all? Driven by a combination of desperation for his family and a sudden, gnawing curiosity, he trudged through the deep, crusted snow, his feet numb, his face aching from the cold. He did not know what he would find, but he knew he could no longer stand the failure of his own home. He reached her door and knocked, his gloved fist making a dull, solid thud. When Alara opened the door, the first thing that hit him was not a person, but a thing. A solid wall of calm, steady warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overstuffed stove. It was a gentle, pervasive heat, like the air on a perfect day in early June. It was unbelievable. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the raging cold, and stood there, stunned into silence. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom of his own frost-caked home, took a moment to adjust. He saw Lars playing on the floor with wooden toys, his cheeks rosy. He saw Alara, calm and composed, wearing a simple dress with no need for a shawl or blankets. He looked at her stove, a small fire purring gently within it. And then he looked at her wood box. It was nearly full. In 3 days, she had used less wood than he had burned that morning alone. He looked up at the ceiling. It was just a ceiling of thick, smooth planks, but he could feel the warmth radiating from it. He reached out and touched an interior wall. It was not just free of frost, it was cool, but not cold. The very structure of the house felt stable, serene, and warm. He, the master builder, was standing in a freezing, failing box of his own expert making. She, the foolish widow, was living in a sanctuary. The sheer, undeniable truth of it washed over him, sweeping away his pride, his certainty, and his lifelong belief in the ways of his fathers. He was wrong. It was a simple, devastating, and liberating realization. He had laughed at her. He had pitied her. And he had been a complete and utter fool. Alara did not say a word of reproach. There was no hint of triumph in her eyes, no smug satisfaction. She simply moved to the kettle on the stove, her movements unhurried and graceful. "Come in, Brant," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The wind is fierce. Sit and have some tea." She offered him a seat at her small wooden table. It was an act of simple hospitality, but for Brant, it felt like an act of profound grace. He sat, removing his frozen gloves, and held his hands out, not to the stove, but to the air itself, feeling the impossible, even warmth. He could not speak. He could only look around the small, quiet room, a testament to an idea he had dismissed as madness. After a few moments of stunned silence, Brant finally found his voice. It was hoarse, humbled. "My family," he said, looking at Alara, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. "My wood is almost gone. The house, it is colder than the outside." He did not need to say more. Alara simply nodded. "Bring them here," she said. "There is room enough." Brant left without another word, moving with a new and urgent purpose. He returned 20 minutes later with his wife and 2 sons, all of them bundled to their eyes, shivering violently, their faces etched with misery. The moment they stepped inside Alara's cabin, their reaction was the same as his, a collective gasp of disbelief as the gentle, pervasive warmth enveloped them. His wife began to weep, tears of pure, unadulterated relief freezing on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. The news of Brant, the valley's master builder, abandoning his own home for the shelter of the Mud Hat cabin, traveled as if carried on the wind itself. The next morning, despite the unabated cold, a small procession of neighbors made their way to Alara's home. They came not to mock, but to see. One by one, they stepped inside, and one by one, they were struck silent by the same miracle. They saw the calm, the quiet, the impossible warmth. They saw her nearly full wood box. They looked at each other, the same realization dawning in every face. Their laughter from the autumn months echoed in their minds, a bitter and shameful sound. They had been so certain, so proud in their shared wisdom, and they had been profoundly, dangerously wrong. The widow's folly was, in fact, the widow's genius. That afternoon, after the last of the visitors had left, their minds reeling with what they had witnessed, Brant approached Ilara again. He stood before her, his large frame stooped, his head bowed. He held his worn felt hat in his hands, twisting it nervously. The pride that had defined him was gone, replaced by a raw and honest humility. "Ilara," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a fool, a proud, blind fool. I laughed at you. I told you that you would bring this house down on your head." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "But it is my house that is failing. It is my family that was freezing." He took a deep breath. "Will you teach me? Will you teach us?" Ilara looked at the man who had led the chorus of mockery against her. She saw no satisfaction in his humbled state, only a shared humanity, a shared struggle against the harshness of their world. She simply nodded. "There is nothing to forgive," she said softly, "and everything to share." She went to the small chest where her husband had kept his belongings and retrieved the worn, ink-stained books. She laid them on the table, their pages filled with the diagrams and principles that had been her guide. She then unrolled her own drawings, the rough sketches she had made to translate the old-world ideas into a new-world reality. She held nothing back. She explained the concept of thermal mass, how the thick clay roof acted like a stone warmed by a fire, holding the heat long after the flames had died down. She explained the importance of the waterproof membrane, the strength of the truss design, the necessity of the stone buttresses to support the immense weight. She answered every question with patience and clarity, her voice calm and steady in the warm, quiet air of the cabin she had built with her own 2 hands. When the ice wolf finally broke and a milder, more normal winter returned, the Gray Valley was a changed place. The social hierarchy, once built on tradition and established skill, had been upended. Quiet, observant Ilara was now the most respected voice in the settlement, and Brant, the former master, had become her most devoted student. That spring, a new sound echoed through the valley. It was not the familiar ring of the axe or the rasp of the saw. It was the sound of shovels digging into clay, the squelch of mud being mixed with straw, the thud of heavy earth being packed into place. Led by Brant, who now worked with the fervor of a convert, the community began to rebuild. They did not tear down their homes, but transformed them. They started with the cabins of the elderly and the families with the most children, the most vulnerable among them. Working together, they reinforced walls, built new, low-pitched trusses, and laid the thick, insulating roofs of clay and sod. Ilara moved from homestead to homestead, not as a commander, but as a quiet advisor, inspecting the truss work, checking the consistency of the clay mixture, offering gentle corrections. The landscape of the settlement began to physically change. The sharp, pointed roofs that had defined the valley for a generation were replaced by low, sturdy living roofs that promised not just shelter, but sanctuary. The story of the Gray Valley's transformation spread beyond its borders. A government surveyor, charting the territory the following year, was astonished by the unusual construction. He was even more astonished by the settlers' stories. They told him of the ice wolf, the great storm that had brought other, less prepared settlements to the brink of starvation and ruin. And they told him how they had weathered it, warm and secure, burning a fraction of the wood they once had. The surveyor took meticulous notes, sketching the design of the Gray Valley roof and documenting Ilara's principles of thermal mass. His report, filed in a dusty office in the capital, became a quiet legend among architects and engineers, a practical lesson in climate-adapted design that would influence settlement patterns in the Northern Territories for decades to come. Elara never sought credit or praise. She continued to live her quiet life, raising her son in the warm, safe home she had built for him. But her legacy was written across the landscape of the valley. It was in the thin wisps of smoke rising from the chimneys on cold days, a sign not of desperation, but of quiet efficiency. It was in the laughter of children playing outside, no longer confined to the small circle of warmth around a single stove. The people of the Grey Valley had learned a lesson far more profound than how to build a better roof. They learned that the most dangerous cold is not the one that comes from the sky, but the one that settles in the mind, the chill of certainty that closes it off to new ideas. They learned that true wisdom is often quiet, and that the strongest shelter is not built from the thickest logs, but from the humility to admit you are wrong, and the courage to learn a new way. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet wisdom, share it with someone who believes in listening to the voices that others ignore. And follow for more inspirational stories of courage, survival, and ingenuity.